people like me. You need people like me so you can point your fucking fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. Reigning WBO Super Bantamweight champion of France, Siegling Lefebvre, took to social media to call out her fellow champion, her fellow Super Bantamweight, Shernika Johnson.
The caption that reads, "Hello, Sugar Neeks, how are you?"
My team sent a message to yours a few days ago to talk about a unification. I look forward to your response. Take care of yourself. A Twitter user that goes by the name Sinead Babington stated, Neek's last tweet is from 2018. So I think you'll be waiting for a response here, to which Siegling replied, I'll try her on Instagram. It seems that the newly crowned WBO champion is on the hunt, and she's in a hurry to consolidate titles with the newly crowned IBF champion, Shernika Johnson, who became IBF champion in her last fight against Mexico's own Melissa Esquivel for what was the vacant IBF title. An interesting match. Both Siegling Lefebvre and Shernika Johnson. They're more boxers than brawlers.
They are characteristically cerebral fighters. They've exhibited mean streaks.
They both have, though not akin to what you see from a Chantel Cameron or a Mary McGee. For the most part, both Shernika Johnson and Siegling Lefebvre, they're cerebral fighters.
The fight between them, its outcome would be determined on who's going to break character, I think.
A generalized statement that adequately characterizes the situation between them. You have two cerebral fighters, two boxers essentially, and the outcome really would be determined based on who's going to break character and who's going to be aggressive, who's going to take it to the other fighter, the other champion.
Siegling Lefebvre's got good dimensions for a super bantamweight. She could probably campaign as high as feather.
She is more streamlined, more wiry, longer levers than Shernika Johnson. Shernika Johnson, who moved up from bantamweight up to super bantamweight, from 118 up to 122 pounds.
She's a little bit fuller, sturdier than Siegling Lefebvre, not as wiry.
Both fighters exhibit good movement, good footwork, good athleticism. Neither fighter can be accused of being the biggest puncher.
I think the biggest puncher as far as super bantamweight champions would have to be Venezuela's own Rivas.
Yeah, she's a bigger puncher than both of them. I like the gamesmanship from Siegling Lefebvre, the willingness to take on another champion at this weight, the willingness to unify, take out the competition, though I don't actually think she's going to get Shernika Johnson in the ring. I don't see Shernika traveling to France for Siegling's WBO title. If anybody's going to travel, it might end up being Siegling that travels to Australia.
Yeah, I could see that happening.
If anything happens at all, don't forget that Matchroom has two prize stallions, two unbeaten up-and-comers and one active reigning world champion at this weight. They've got Rivas, reigning WBA champion at this weight, a more experienced fighter, more experienced champion than either Shernika Johnson and Siegling Lefebvre. And they also have unbeaten Ramla Ali, who's going to be returning to action very soon on the undercard of Chizoria versus Pulev 2. They also have unbeaten Ali Scotney.
This is important.
When a major promotional outfit like a Matchroom has three prize stallions campaigning at this same weight, it's quite possible that these two champions, rather than facing each other, they may end up facing one of these fighters instead, as it represents, it could, a greater financial opportunity for either a Siegling Lefebvre or a Shernika Johnson.
They might make more money fighting a Matchroom fighter than unifying with each other.
Just something to consider. I'm surely not against them unifying titles with each other. I'm not against two champions taking each other on. I'm just saying.
This is a business, and that's how the powers that be might choose to play it.
Comes to Ramla Ali, who I mentioned earlier, Matchroom's own unbeaten Ramla Ali, who's now based out of America, being trained by veteran trainer Manny Robles. She's going to be taking on Argentinian slugger Agustina Rojas, a fighter who's campaigned anywhere from super flyweight all the way up to super bantamweight, as her last two fights, her last two professional bouts were super bantamweight contests, though before that, she seemed to hover around flyweight or super flyweight.
Very similar experience level to Ramla Ali.
Sporting a professional record of 6 wins and 1 loss to Ramla Ali's 5 wins, no losses, and no draws. Ramla's got a few years on Agustina Rojas. She's about 9 years older than Agustina. 32 years old, to Augustina, who's very fresh, very young, vibrant, 23. Ramla's got more generous physical dimensions than Augustina as well. Ramla stands in at about 5'7". Those are very good physical dimensions for a super bantamweight. Generous. Ramla could see herself at some point campaigning as high as featherweight because she has such generous physical dimensions, whereas Augustina is more compact, more pocket-sized.
Augustina, who's fought 2 times already this year. She was in action in April.
Then again last month in June. She's going to be in action again this month on the 9th on the undercard of Chisora versus Pulev 2 against Ramla Ali. That way, Ramla Ali is taking on a fresh-faced fighter, fresh-faced youngster. Not a fighter with a losing record or a fighter who's coming right off a loss. Not a fighter who's got ring rust they need to shake off.
Not even a fighter that's new to this weight, as Rojas' last 2 fights were super bantamweight contests.
Ramla herself has kept a busy schedule. She fought 3 times last year, only once this year, back in March.
This fight with Augustina will be her 2nd fight this year, 2nd fight in the year of 2022.
She's coming along. She's developing a nice pro style. With Manny Robles in her corner, you see the difference in Ramla from the time she debuted as a professional 5 fights ago till now.
She's coming along nicely.
Going to take a closer look at what it is Augustina Rojas can do ahead of this fight with Ramla Ali, but so far so good. They're keeping her busy, they're keeping her active, she's developing, and pretty soon she could be challenging either a Shernika Johnson or a Siegeling Lefebvre for a world title, provided she can make it past Augustina Rojas.
Keep your eyes peeled for this later on this month on the 9th.
The undercard of Chisora versus Pulev. In other news, I'm sure most of you have heard by now that Liam Beefy Smith has migrated from the Matchroom DAZN side of things over to Sky and BOXXER, and the mission to become a 2-time world champion starts today.
His last 2 fights were fought under the Matchroom banner.
The Anthony Fowler fight, the Jesse Vargas fight, those were all part of Matchroom shows. He's gotten himself back in the winner's bracket, given his career a shot in the arm, and he seems to have world title aspirations. They're playing with the idea of Liam Beefy Smith taking on Chris Eubank Jr., who is in sore need of opponent options. They ain't got that many guys, if any, for Chris Eubank Jr. to fight on that side of things, but they have at least one now.
Liam Beefy Smith.
Former WBO junior middleweight champion Liam Beefy Smith, who does seem to have world title aspirations, though based on the lay of the land and how things are looking between 154 pounds and 160, I'd wager that Liam stands a better chance of picking up a title at 160 than he does at 154 pounds. At 154 pounds, the PBC's got the run of the place. All the alphabet titles are on their side of things.
Whereas the situation at middleweight is more negotiable.
Very soon, Gennady Golovkin, that division's unified champion in possession of both the WBA and IBF alphabet titles, he's going to be in action against Canelo Alvarez, and depending on what happens in that fight, he might decide to call it a career. He's not saying it here and now that he's going to retire, but if that fight proves to be a physically taxing fight for what is an aging fighter, an aging champion, a guy in his 40s, if that fight takes a lot out of Gennady, he may not come back, and if he doesn't, those 2 alphabet titles, they go vacant.
And they become available for fighters like Liam Smith to fight for.
Liam Smith, a fan-friendly fighter, a familiar face, and a former champion. This is a very good signing for the people over there at Sky Sports and BOXXER. I don't know how rudimentary, how integral Liam Smith was to the Matchroom stable of fighters. He's been there and done that with them, but for Sky and BOXXER, who are looking to beef up their stable of fighters, their stable of familiar faces, this is a good signing.
Sky and BOXXER are focusing on the domestic UK scene, whereas Matchroom is more international.
Don't worry too much about how Matchroom is doing, losing domestic fighters like Chris Billum Smith and Liam Smith.
Yeah, they got that Pacheco kid that they're grooming, Mark Castro, Bam Rodriguez.
Bright young upstart with a high ceiling and a lot of upside, only 22 years old, coming off 2 career best wins over 2 of the 4 kings at super flyweight. A kid who has the potential to go all the way and become one of the best and brightest young fighters, best and brightest young faces in the entire sport of boxing. Don't worry too much about Matchroom losing guys like Chris Billum Smith and Liam Smith to the people over there at Sky and BOXXER when they've got somebody like Bam Rodriguez, who they've just offered an extended deal to.
He's going to be fighting under the Matchroom banner for the foreseeable future, and he has the inside track on those Chicano fans.
The biggest consumers of boxing as a sport in this country. Don't worry too much about how Matchroom is doing without Chris Billum Smith or without Liam Smith, all although those are very good signings, very good situations for the people over there at Sky and BOXXER, who seem to be focusing on the domestic UK scene as opposed to Matchroom, who's more international.
This signing wasn't what I expected, though it's not really unexpected.
It's not. We know that Adam Smith and Ben Shalom are looking to poach some of the familiar faces over there on the Matchroom side of things. Fighters like Chris Billum Smith and Liam Smith, no relation.
Yeah, they're not related, but Callum Smith,
Liam's younger brother, former WBA super middleweight champion Callum Smith. It's been a while since we saw that guy in action. That highlight reel knockout over Lennon Castillo.
feels like it was ages ago.
What the hell's going on with that guy? Let's be honest. If Sky Sports and BOXXER were able to bring him into the fray, that would be a nice addition to their stable. Certainly would help beef it up. He's a familiar face.
Hey, they convinced Beefy to cross over. Maybe they can convince Callum to cross over as well.
Now, if Callum Smith were to cross over to Sky the same way his older brother just did, his older brother Beefy, well, that pretty much rules out any chance of seeing him take on Joshua Buatsi or
That's off.
Dmitry Bivol. Those are Matchroom fighters. If he goes to Sky, those fights are off the table. But what fights might be on the table for the likes of Callum Smith if he were to follow his brother? Well, Artur Beterbiev, he wouldn't be far away. He wouldn't be out of arm's reach. That's right. Don't forget, Sky Sports is Top Rank's UK broadcast partner.
Artur Beterbiev's supposed to be in the UK very soon against Anthony Yard.
Bob's loaning Artur out to Frank. Most people favor Artur to win that fight by way of knockout. And beyond that fight, because Sky Sports is Top Rank's UK broadcast partner, in a scenario where Callum Smith leaves Matchroom and goes over to BOXXER, starts fighting on Sky, you could make a fight between Artur and Callum on Sky. In this hypothetical scenario, Artur Beterbiev will have already fought on BT and already taken out Anthony Yard, a familiar face. He would then go over to Sky Sports, an even bigger platform than BT, take on another familiar face, another UK fighter.
That could happen.
It could happen because Bob doesn't seem to be in any hurry to make that Artur Beterbiev versus Dmitry Bivol undisputed light heavyweight title fight. So he'd shop him around, get him other fights, other options that allow him to keep the guy busy without having to work with Eddie. It's a distinct possibility because Callum's older brother just migrated from Matchroom over to BOXXER.
If Liam crossed over from Matchroom over to BOXXER, his younger brother Callum might not be far behind.
This isn't bad news for the fight fans. This accents what I've been telling you ever since Matchroom parted ways with Sky. The UK boxing scene is going to become a lot more competitive. The promoters and the powers that be, their jobs are going to get a little bit harder. Everybody's got to up the ante. But for the fight fans,
A competitive market is an entertaining market for the fight fans.
because everybody has to step it up. Nobody can afford to be asleep at the wheel. They've got to put on the best shows, the best fights involving the best fighters as to keep up with the Joneses. So believe it or not, this isn't bad. Not for me and you. And finally, in reference to Artur Beterbiev, who I just mentioned, Arum praises Beterbiev.
I think he may be the best ever. At 175 pounds, I think he may be the best ever. And I go back to Bob Foster, John Conti, Matthew, Saad Muhammad, Eddie Gregory, Mustafa Muhammad. I've never seen a light heavyweight like him.
Listen, I think it's great that Artur Beterbiev is just one belt away from becoming this division's undisputed champion. I think it's great that people are finally taking notice of who he is and what he can do and all that jazz, but
Let's curb our enthusiasm here. He beat Joe Smith Jr. Joe's been beat before.
Dmitry Bivol beat him years ago, and Bob doesn't seem to put any emphasis on that fight.
So before you crown him as the best light heavyweight that ever was a light heavyweight, why don't you at least prove that he's the best light heavyweight in this era?
Let him prove it against Dmitry Bivol.
I didn't think Smith would do that kind of fight, but everybody said Beterbiev starts slow, so when he went and made it a fight early, he thought that was his best chance, but you can't do that with a guy like Beterbiev, who just throws nuclear bombs.
DAZN had responded to Bob Arum, and he's willing to have a conversation on making a 175-pound undisputed fight between Artur and Dmitry. Asked to respond to Arum's comments, Joe Markowski, an executive vice president at DAZN, took issue with Arum's seemingly preemptive combative stance and apparent objection to broaching the topic of collaboration. While cross-promotional events are admittedly rare in boxing, given the competing network obligations of boxing's top promoters, Markowski thought it was foolhardy, nevertheless, for Arum to relay the public that he had no wish to make a fight that would otherwise satisfy the sports fans. That's absurd, right? Markowski said of Arum's attitude in an interview with BoxingScene.com, and I'll tell you why. I've got a lot of respect for Bob, but there's a problem in boxing with promoters and broadcasters refusing to cooperate with other promoters and other broadcasters. Business is all about supply and demand, and if the people are demanding a fight between Artur and Dmitry, it's the promoter's job to supply that demand. And if what you supply are substitutes and alternatives instead, what you're going to end up with is a dwindling audience.
You go to a restaurant because you got a hankering for a steak.
You want a steak? Not fettuccine Alfredo, not chicken parmigiana. You came for a steak, and if they can't give you that, you take your business elsewhere, my friend.
That's the way it works.
That's the way it is. Fights will not happen if people have that attitude. As a boxing promoter, Bob Arum's job and the job of his company is to make boxing fights happen that the public will want. We are very willing to work with other promoters and other broadcasters for the bigger fights on the pay-per-view platform. We can price match. We can operate in a shared rights environment. We are very willing to do that. And that is a viable possibility because DAZN, unlike ESPN, it's a global streaming app. So maybe DAZN has the rights to Beterbiev versus Bivol in the United Kingdom, and ESPN and Top Rank can keep those rights in the United States. Maybe DAZN can show the fight in other territories.
Maybe they have the rights in the UK and in Canada.
Well, Top Rank and ESPN keep the rights for the fight here in the US of A, here in America. Everybody wins. The fighters get the fight that they want, the fight that they need, the fight fans get the fight that they're asking for, and the promoters still get to profiteer off of the fight, as do the streaming platforms.
The competing platforms.
Boxing is a niche sport, and that niche sport is at its best when fights are happening, regardless of network politics and special interests. When fights aren't happening, what does happen is the audience dwindles. The audience shrinks.
That's not good for anybody.
Again, huge respect for Bob Arum, a legend of the promotional game, but that's the wrong way to approach this, Markowski said. There's been a couple of things that he's said recently, his comments on the women's fights, that suggest he may not be thinking with all of his faculties. I'm surprised he took that line.
I think a lot of people were surprised, including Michaela Mayer, who Top Rank promotes.
If they want to have a conversation with us about making a deal around that, then get in touch, Markowski said. They've got our email addresses. They've got our phone numbers. They know who we are. We are very willing to have a conversation. We want to make that fight happen. We don't want to block fights from happening because of critical contractual reasons.
Artur needs that fight to happen sooner rather than later. He's not getting any younger.
And when Top Rank puts distance between themselves and that fight with Dmitry Bivol, you have to wonder, whose best interests do they have in mind?
Not Artur's.